In 1918, a young Italian priest walked into a small chapel in the remote village of San Giovanni Rotondo. What happened next would shake the foundations of the Catholic Church, terrify the Vatican, and create one of the most controversial religious figures in modern history. This priest's hands suddenly began to bleed, not from an injury, not from a wound, but from invisible marks that would remain open, bleeding, and unexplainable for the next 50 years. 5 wounds, matching exactly the wounds of Jesus Christ on the cross. The Vatican's response? They didn't celebrate. They didn't announce a miracle. Instead, they launched one of the most aggressive, secretive investigations in church history. They sent spies. They tapped his confessional. They hired doctors to prove he was a fraud. They banned him from public ministry. They tried to destroy him. Why? What was the Vatican so afraid of? What did they find in those files that terrified them so much they kept them locked away for decades? Today, we're opening those forbidden files. We're revealing secrets that the Church hoped would never see the light of day. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why Padre Pio became the most investigated, the most persecuted, and ultimately, the most beloved saint of the 20th century. But before we dive into these explosive revelations, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now, telling me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Are you in Italy, America, Brazil, the Philippines? Let me know. And if stories of mystery, miracles, and hidden Vatican secrets fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now let's go back to the beginning. Let's meet the man who would become a living legend. Francesco Forgione was born on May 25, 1887, in the small farming village of Pietrelcina in southern Italy. His family was poor, desperately poor. His father, Grazio, worked as a farmer, barely scraping together enough to feed 8 children. His mother, Maria Giuseppa, was a devout Catholic who prayed the rosary every single day. From his earliest years, Francesco was different, strangely different. He didn't play like other children. He spent hours in prayer. He talked about seeing angels and demons as casually as other kids talked about seeing birds and dogs. His mother noticed that he often spoke to invisible beings, carrying on conversations with entities that no one else could see. At first, his family assumed every child had these experiences. It wasn't until years later that Francesco revealed the truth. He had been seeing supernatural beings since before he could remember. Angels visited him regularly, but so did demons, horrifying, violent demons that would physically attack him, leaving real bruises and scratches on his body. One night, when Francesco was just 5 years old, he had an experience that would mark him forever. He was praying in his room when suddenly a beautiful figure appeared before him, radiant, luminous, unlike anything he had ever seen. The figure spoke to him and showed him a vision of his future, a future of suffering, a future of persecution, a future where he would bear the wounds of Christ himself. The child was terrified. He didn't want this destiny. He cried and begged for it to be taken away, but the figure told him that this was God's plan, and there was no escape. Can you imagine being 5 years old and knowing that your life would be defined by suffering, that you would be marked, literally marked, for a path of pain? What's remarkable is that despite this terrifying vision, Francesco didn't run from his destiny. He didn't try to live a normal life. He didn't pretend the vision never happened. Instead, he began preparing himself through prayer and penance for whatever God had planned. His mother noticed changes in her son. He became even more devoted to prayer. He would wake before dawn to attend Mass. He would spend hours in the local church, kneeling before statues of the saints, pouring out his heart to heaven. Other children played games in the streets. Francesco played with eternity. The local priests began to notice this unusual child. They saw his devotion, his seriousness, his spiritual depth that seemed impossible for someone so young. They encouraged him, guided him, helped him discern whether God was truly calling him to religious life. Francesco grew up carrying this secret. He told almost no one about his visions, his angelic visitors, or his demonic attacks. He simply knew that he was called to something extraordinary, even if that something terrified him. At 15, he entered the Capuchin order, a branch of the Franciscan friars known for their strict poverty and intense spirituality. He took the name Brother Pio after Pope Pius V. From that moment on, Francesco Forgione ceased to exist. There was only Padre Pio, but the path to priesthood was brutal. Pio was constantly sick. Mysterious illnesses plagued him throughout his seminary years, fevers that would spike to 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Doctors couldn't explain it. Their thermometers literally couldn't measure temperatures that high. They thought their equipment was broken. But multiple thermometers, multiple doctors, all recorded the same impossible readings. During this time, Pio wrote letters to his spiritual directors describing supernatural experiences that sound like something from a horror movie. Demons would appear in his room at night, taking hideous forms. They would beat him, throw him out of bed, leave him bloody and bruised by morning. His fellow friars would find him collapsed on the floor, covered in inexplicable wounds. But it wasn't just demons. Angels came too. The Virgin Mary appeared to him. Jesus himself spoke to him in visions. Pio described these encounters in vivid detail, though he often begged his directors not to share these letters with anyone. He was embarrassed. He was afraid people would think he was insane. Finally, in 1910, at the age of 23, Pio was ordained a priest. But his health was so fragile that his superiors sent him home to Pietrelcina to recover. For years, he lived in a kind of limbo, too sick to serve in a monastery, but too devoted to abandon his calling. Then, in 1916, everything changed. Pio was assigned to the tiny friary of San Giovanni Rotondo, perched on a remote mountain in the Gargano Peninsula. This obscure, forgotten monastery would become the center of one of the greatest religious phenomena of the 20th century. The monastery itself was ancient, dating back to the 16th century. It sat on a barren mountainside, surrounded by rocky terrain and sparse vegetation. The nearest town was small and poor, its inhabitants eking out a living through farming and herding. It was the last place anyone would expect to become a center of world attention. The friars who lived there led simple lives of prayer and poverty. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, and spent their days in a rhythm of work and worship that had changed little in centuries. Into this quiet world came Padre Pio, still young, still frail, but carrying within him a spiritual intensity that would soon transform everything. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Pio lived quietly among the other friars, praying, celebrating Mass, hearing confessions. But strange things began to happen. Other friars noticed that during Mass, Pio would enter into what appeared to be ecstatic trances. His face would transform. Tears would stream down his cheeks. He would seem to be somewhere else entirely, witnessing events invisible to everyone around him. Then came the reports of unusual phenomena. A sweet, mysterious fragrance would sometimes fill the room when Pio was present. Not incense, not flowers, something else entirely. Witnesses described it as the scent of roses or violets, or sometimes something completely indescribable. This odor of sanctity would follow Pio for the rest of his life, appearing at the strangest times and places. But all of this was just a prelude to the main event. On September 20th, 1918, Padre Pio was alone in the choir of the little church, praying before a crucifix. Suddenly, he saw a mysterious figure approaching him. A celestial being of terrifying beauty, holding a weapon that appeared to be a long, sharp blade of fire. The being hurled the weapon at Pio. It pierced his side, then his hands, then his feet. The pain was beyond description. Pio screamed and collapsed. When he looked at his body, he saw blood flowing from 5 distinct wounds, 2 in his hands, 2 in his feet, 1 in his side. The stigmata, the wounds of Christ. Pio was horrified, not amazed, not grateful, horrified. He immediately wrote to his spiritual director, begging for prayers that God would remove these visible signs. He didn't want attention. He didn't want fame. He wanted to suffer in secret, hidden from the world. But secrets like this can't be kept. Within days, other friars noticed the blood-soaked bandages on Pio's hands. They saw him limping from the wounds in his feet. Word spread to the village. Within weeks, newspapers across Italy were reporting on the miracle of San Giovanni Rotondo. The Vatican's reaction was swift and severe. You have to understand something about the Catholic Church in this era. The early 20th century was a time of profound crisis for the Vatican. Modernism was challenging traditional beliefs. Science was questioning miracles. The Church was terrified of scandal, of anything that might make them look foolish or fraudulent. And here was this unknown priest in a remote mountain village, claiming to bear the wounds of Christ, attracting massive crowds, performing what appeared to be miracles. The Vatican saw not a saint, but a potential catastrophe. In 1919, Pope Benedict XV ordered the first official investigation. The Church sent Dr. Luigi Romanelli, a respected physician, to examine Padre Pio's wounds. What Romanelli found disturbed the Vatican deeply. The wounds were real. They weren't superficial scratches that could be faked. They penetrated completely through Pio's hands. Romanelli could shine a light through one side and see it emerge from the other. The wounds were perfectly round, about the diameter of a coin. They bled continuously, losing about a cup of blood every day. Yet they never became infected. They never healed. They never showed any signs of the normal healing process. Romanelli's report was troubling for Vatican skeptics. He concluded that the wounds could not be explained by any known medical condition. They could not have been self-inflicted without leaving obvious signs of manipulation. They defied natural explanation. But instead of accepting this as evidence of a miracle, the Vatican doubled down on their investigation. They sent more doctors, more theologians, more investigators. They were determined to find evidence of fraud. Dr. Amico Bignami, a professor of pathology at the University of Rome, was brought in specifically to debunk Pio. Bignami was a known skeptic, an agnostic who had no sympathy for religious claims. The Vatican was confident he would expose the truth. Bignami examined the wounds extensively. He tested them with various chemicals. He sealed Pio's hands in bandages that couldn't be tampered with. He watched and waited for signs of healing or fraud. His conclusion shocked everyone. Bignami admitted that the wounds were genuine and that he could find no evidence of self-infliction or deception. He couldn't explain them medically, but being an agnostic, he refused to call them miraculous. He suggested they might be caused by some unknown neurological or psychological condition. The Vatican wasn't satisfied. They sent more investigators, and then they went further than investigation. They began a campaign of active persecution. In 1922, the Holy Office, the Vatican's supreme doctrinal authority, issued its first restrictions on Padre Pio. He was forbidden from showing his wounds publicly. He was forbidden from blessing crowds. He was ordered to celebrate Mass privately, away from the faithful. The reasoning was clear in the internal Vatican documents that would later be revealed. The Church believed Pio was either a deliberate fraud or a psychologically disturbed individual who was unconsciously creating his own wounds. Either way, he was dangerous. Either way, he needed to be stopped. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The Vatican didn't just investigate Pio, they actively tried to destroy his reputation. Secret agents were sent to San Giovanni Rotondo, not official investigators, spies. These agents posed as pilgrims and penitents. They attended Pio's masses, they went to his confessional. They reported everything back to Rome. One particularly disturbing revelation from the declassified files involves the bugging of Padre Pio's confessional. The Vatican secretly recorded his conversations with penitents, hoping to catch him in some scandal, some confession of fraud, some evidence of wrongdoing. They found nothing, but they kept searching. In 1923, the Holy Office issued an extraordinary declaration. They stated that the events surrounding Padre Pio were not of supernatural origin. They stopped short of calling him a fraud directly, but the implication was clear. The Vatican wanted nothing to do with him. Pio was effectively silenced. For nearly a decade, he was forbidden from celebrating public mass, from hearing confessions, from having any contact with the faithful. He was a prisoner in his own monastery, watched constantly by Vatican-appointed monitors. What was Pio's response to this persecution? Did he rebel? Did he protest? Did he proclaim his innocence to the world? No, he submitted completely. He obeyed every restriction without complaint. He never spoke against the church, never criticized his persecutors, never defended himself publicly. He simply said, "I am a son of obedience," and accepted his fate. This quiet obedience in the face of injustice became one of the most powerful testimonies to Pio's character. Anyone perpetrating a fraud would have fought back, would have defended themselves, would have protested their innocence. Pio did none of these things. He simply continued to pray, to suffer, and to wait for God's vindication. During these years of exile, strange reports continued to emerge from San Giovanni Rotondo. Pilgrims who had visited Pio before his silencing reported miraculous healings. People claimed to see Pio appearing to them in distant locations, sometimes thousands of miles away, offering comfort, guidance, or healing. This phenomenon, known as bilocation, would become one of the most documented and controversial aspects of Pio's ministry. Let me tell you about one of the most famous cases of bilocation, because it illustrates just how strange Pio's story really gets. In 1945, during World War II, American bombers were conducting missions over Italy. One squadron was assigned to bomb San Giovanni Rotondo, which had been identified as a potential German military position. As the pilots approached their target, something impossible happened. A figure appeared in the sky ahead of their planes, a monk in brown robes floating in mid-air, holding up his hands to stop them. The pilots were shocked, terrified. They immediately aborted the mission and returned to base. When they reported what they had seen, their commanders were incredulous. But the pilots were adamant. They had all seen the same thing, a monk in the sky, bleeding hands, a commanding presence that made it impossible for them to continue their mission. After the war, one of these pilots made a pilgrimage to San Giovanni Rotondo. He wanted to understand what had happened. As he waited in line to see Padre Pio, the priest approached him, smiled, and said, "So, you're the one. You were going to bomb us." The pilot had never met Pio, had never told anyone at the monastery about his experience, yet Pio knew. He had been there, in the sky, stopping those bombs. Witnesses said the pilot collapsed in tears. This is just one of hundreds of documented bilocation cases. Priests in distant cities reported Pio appearing during their masses to assist them. Sick people in hospitals described Pio visiting their bedsides, even though he never left his monastery. Soldiers in battle saw him on the front lines, protecting them from harm. How do you explain this? The Vatican couldn't, and that scared them. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, the investigation continued. New doctors were sent. New theologians examined the evidence. The files grew thicker and thicker. The Vatican was building a case, but they couldn't quite determine what kind of case it was. Then, in 1947, a young Polish priest visited San Giovanni Rotondo. His name was Karol Wojtyla, and he would later become Pope John Paul II. Wojtyla was so moved by his encounter with Padre Pio that he wrote him a letter years later, asking for prayers for a friend who was suffering from cancer. According to multiple witnesses, Pio predicted that Wojtyla would one day lead the church. He also reportedly told Wojtyla about a future assassination attempt, urging him to be careful. In 1981, Pope John Paul II was shot in St. Peter's Square. He survived, and many believe it was partly due to the intercession of Padre Pio, who had died 13 years earlier. But let's go back to the investigation. In the 1960s, after the liberalizing reforms of the Second Vatican Council, the Church's attitude toward Pio began to shift. The restrictions were gradually lifted. In 1964, Pope Paul VI granted Pio full permission to celebrate Mass publicly again. The crowds that had been held back for decades came flooding back. By this time, Pio was in his late 70s, frail and suffering. The stigmata that had marked his body for 50 years had never healed. He continued to bleed, continued to suffer, continued to offer up his pain for the souls of others. Padre Pio died on September 23, 1968, just 3 days after the 50th anniversary of receiving the stigmata. According to witnesses, something extraordinary happened at the moment of his death. The stigmata wounds, which had bled continuously for half a century, suddenly closed. His skin became smooth and unblemished, as if the wounds had never existed. The friars who were present described the moment as both sorrowful and miraculous. They had watched Pio suffer for decades. They had seen the blood, the pain, the constant struggle. And now, in death, all of that suffering was erased. His hands, which had been pierced and bleeding for 50 years, were suddenly perfect. His feet, his side, all the wounds that had defined his physical existence simply vanished. Doctors who examined his body were stunned. There was no scar tissue, no evidence of the wounds that had been documented thousands of times over 50 years. It was as if they had simply vanished, taken back by whatever power had given them in the first place. His body was clothed in his capuchin habit and placed in a simple wooden coffin. Thousands of people filed past to pay their respects. Many reported that his body emitted the same mysterious fragrance that had followed him in life, the odor of sanctity that had been documented so many times. But the story doesn't end with Pio's death. In some ways, it was just beginning. Within hours of his passing, reports began flooding in from around the world. People claimed that Pio had appeared to them, sometimes at the exact moment of his death, sometimes in the days and weeks that followed. A dead man was appearing to the living, offering comfort, guidance, and healing. The Vatican had a new problem on their hands. Padre Pio was more popular dead than he had been alive. Millions of pilgrims descended on San Giovanni Rotondo every year, making it one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in the world. Calls for his canonization began immediately and grew louder with each passing year. But the Vatican still had those files. Decades of investigation, thousands of pages of testimony, medical reports, theological analyses, and secret surveillance. What did they contain? And why did the Vatican keep them sealed for so long? In 2008, 40 years after Pio's death, portions of the Vatican's secret files were finally declassified. What they revealed was explosive. The files contained detailed reports from Vatican investigators who had been sent to discredit Pio. They contained transcripts of secretly recorded confessions. They contained correspondence between Vatican officials discussing strategies for silencing him. And perhaps most damning, they contained evidence that some officials had fabricated allegations against him. One of the most sensational allegations involved a woman named Cleonis Morcaldi, In the 1920s, Vatican investigators claimed that Pio had carried on an inappropriate relationship with this woman. They produced letters that allegedly proved a romantic or sexual connection. When the files were declassified, the truth emerged. The letters were real, but they had been deliberately taken out of context. Morcaldi was one of Pio's spiritual daughters, a woman he had guided in her faith for years. Their correspondence was entirely appropriate, filled with spiritual guidance and pastoral care. There was nothing romantic or sexual about it. Vatican officials had twisted innocent letters into a scandal, trying to destroy a man they couldn't understand and couldn't control. The declassified files also revealed the extent of the surveillance operation. Pio had been watched constantly for decades. His every word, every action, every meeting was recorded and reported. The Church had treated him not as a priest, but as a suspect, a criminal to be monitored and controlled. Why? The files reveal that many Vatican officials simply couldn't accept the possibility that the stigmata were genuine. In their minds, there had to be a natural explanation. There had to be fraud. Because if the wounds were real, if a living man in the 20th century was bearing the wounds of Christ, what did that mean for a church that had become increasingly rationalized and bureaucratic? Padre Pio was a threat, not because he was a fraud, but because he might be genuine. And a genuine mystic, a living saint performing miracles before the eyes of the world, was something the modern Vatican didn't know how to handle. Let's talk about some of the documented miracles, because the evidence is remarkable. The canonization process for saints in the Catholic Church requires proof of miracles, not just claims, but medically documented, scientifically investigated miracles. For Padre Pio, the Vatican had an embarrassment of riches. Thousands of claimed miracles, hundreds with solid documentation. The first miracle officially accepted for Pio's beatification involved a woman named Consiglia de Martino. In the year 2000, Consiglia was diagnosed with a severe respiratory condition that had left her lungs devastated. Multiple doctors confirmed she had only months to live. Her lungs were, in medical terms, destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. Consiglia prayed to Padre Pio for help. On the night of October 20th, 2000, she had a dream. In the dream, Padre Pio appeared to her and told her she was healed. When she woke up, she felt different, stronger. She could breathe freely for the first time in years. Her doctors were called in. They ran tests, X-rays, CT scans, complete respiratory evaluations. What they found was impossible. Her lungs were perfect. Not just improved, perfect. The extensive damage that had been documented in previous scans was simply gone. New, healthy tissue had appeared where destroyed tissue had been. Her doctors wrote that there was no medical explanation for what had happened. The word they used was miraculous. This case was investigated exhaustively by Vatican medical experts, independent physicians, and theological consultants. All of them agreed that the healing defied natural explanation. The second miracle accepted for Pio's canonization involved a boy named Matteo Pio Colella. In 2001, Matteo was diagnosed with acute meningitis. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Multiple organs failed. Doctors declared him clinically dead. His parents were told to say goodbye. Matteo's mother refused to give up. She prayed desperately to Padre Pio, begging for her son's life. She placed a glove that had belonged to Padre Pio on her son's body. Within hours, Matteo began to recover. Not gradually, rapidly. His organs, which had been failing, started functioning normally. His brain, which doctors believed had suffered irreversible damage, showed no signs of injury. Within days, he was sitting up, talking, playing. He made a complete recovery with no lasting effects. The medical team that had treated Matteo was astonished. They had been preparing death certificates. Now they were watching a boy play who should have been dead and buried. They documented every aspect of his illness and recovery and could find no medical explanation. These are just two examples from an ocean of claimed miracles. Cancers that disappeared, paralyzed limbs that moved again, blind eyes that could see, deaf ears that could hear. The files are filled with testimonies, medical records, and expert evaluations. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Miracles? In the 20th century? Surely there must be explanations. Surely these are exaggerations or mistakes. And that's exactly what Vatican investigators thought for decades. They assumed they would find fraud. They assumed they would find natural explanations. But case after case, investigation after investigation, they came up empty. The Vatican, the most skeptical organization in the world when it comes to miracle claims, couldn't debunk Padre Pio. And believe me, they tried. Let's talk about some of the other supernatural phenomena associated with Pio, because the stigmata and the healings are just the beginning. The odor of sanctity. Throughout his life, people around Padre Pio reported smelling inexplicable fragrances. The smell of roses, violets, incense, sometimes tobacco or other unusual scents. These fragrances would appear suddenly and disappear just as quickly. They were reported not just at the monastery, but in distant locations, often associated with answered prayers or moments of spiritual significance. One documented case involved a woman in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She had never met Padre Pio, never been to Italy, but she had been praying to him for help with a desperate situation. Suddenly, her room filled with the overwhelming scent of roses. At that exact moment, thousands of miles away, Padre Pio was seen to smile during Mass and say, "She will be helped." The reading of hearts. Countless testimonies describe Padre Pio's ability to know the sins and secrets of people he had never met. Penitents would come to his confessional, and before they could speak a word, Pio would begin listing their sins. Not general accusations, but specific details, names, dates, places, things no one could possibly know. Many left his confessional in tears, not from shame, but from the overwhelming experience of being truly known by another person. Some were sent away before they could confess, Pio telling them they had not completed a proper examination of conscience, naming specific sins they had forgotten or deliberately concealed. This gift terrified many people, but it also converted thousands. How do you remain skeptical when a stranger tells you the deepest secrets of your heart? Prophecy. Padre Pio made numerous predictions that came true, often in dramatic fashion. He predicted the election of Pope John Paul II decades before it happened. He predicted the assassination attempt against that same pope. He predicted specific events in the lives of individuals who came to see him, events that would not occur for years or decades. One famous prophecy involved a young Italian politician who visited Pio in the 1950s. Pio looked at him and said, "You will become famous, very famous, and then you will die violently." The politician laughed it off. His name was Aldo Moro, and in 1978, he was kidnapped and murdered by terrorists. Padre Pio had been dead for 10 years. Levitation. Multiple eyewitnesses reported seeing Padre Pio lifted off the ground during prayer, sometimes rising several feet in the air. These were not credulous peasants looking for miracles. Among the witnesses were educated professionals, doctors, lawyers, priests. Their testimonies are remarkably consistent. Temperature phenomena. We mentioned earlier that Pio's fevers would register at impossible temperatures during his early years. This continued throughout his life. Thermometers would break or give impossible readings when measuring his body temperature. During Mass, witnesses reported feeling waves of heat emanating from him as if he were on fire from within. Luminous phenomena. Some witnesses reported seeing light emanating from Padre Pio during prayer or Mass. Not metaphorical light, actual visible light, glowing halos around his head, rays of light from his hands, an entire church illuminated by an inexplicable radiance during his prayers. Now you might ask, why haven't you heard these stories before? Why isn't Padre Pio a household name everywhere in the world? Part of the answer is the Vatican's decades of suppression. They kept the files sealed. They restricted access to Pio during his lifetime. They actively worked to minimize his visibility and influence. By the time they reversed course, Pio was dead, and his story had already been confined to Catholic circles. But there's another reason. In our modern secular age, stories like this make people uncomfortable. They don't fit our neat categories. They challenge our assumptions about what's possible. It's easier to ignore them, to dismiss them as religious fantasy, than to grapple with their implications. But the evidence exists. Thousands of testimonies, medical records, Vatican files. The story of Padre Pio is one of the most documented supernatural phenomena in modern history. You can dismiss it, but you can't make it disappear. On June 16, 2002, Pope John Paul II canonized Padre Pio as a saint of the Catholic Church. An estimated 300,000 people attended the ceremony in Rome. Millions more watched around the world. In his homily, John Paul called Pio a generous dispenser of divine mercy. He praised his heroic virtue, his profound spirituality, his love for the suffering. He made no mention of the decades of persecution, no mention of the false accusations, no mention of the Vatican's attempts to destroy him. But those of us who have studied the files know the truth. Padre Pio was not just a saint who was recognized by the Church. He was a saint who was tested by the Church, attacked by the Church, and vindicated despite the Church's best efforts to bring him down. What does all of this mean? Why does it matter? I think Padre Pio's story speaks to something deep in the human experience. We want to believe that the supernatural is real. We want to believe that miracles are possible. We want to believe that there's more to existence than what we can see and touch and measure. Padre Pio offers us evidence for that belief, not proof. Evidence, eyewitness testimonies, medical documentation, official investigations that couldn't explain what they found, a lifetime of phenomena that defied natural explanation. You can choose to dismiss all of this. You can chalk it up to mass hysteria, confirmation bias, or clever deception. That's your right. But I would encourage you to look at the evidence yourself. Read the testimonies, study the medical reports, examine the Vatican files that were kept secret for so long. And ask yourself, what if it's true? What if, in the 20th century, in our modern age of science and skepticism, there lived a man who bore the wounds of Christ, who appeared in multiple places at once, who healed the sick and read the secrets of hearts, who was attacked by his own church and vindicated by history? What would that mean for our understanding of reality? What would that mean for our assumptions about what's possible? Padre Pio's story challenges us. It challenges our skepticism. It challenges our comfortable materialism. It challenges our assumption that we have the world figured out. And maybe that's exactly why the Vatican tried so hard to suppress it. Not because they knew it was false, but because they feared it might be true. Before I go, I want to share one final story. One that has always stayed with me. In the last years of his life, Padre Pio was asked by a journalist what he wanted people to remember about him after he was gone. He could have talked about the stigmata. He could have talked about the miracles. He could have defended himself against the accusations that had plagued him for decades. Instead, he said simply, "I am only a poor friar who prays." That was it. After 50 years of bearing Christ's wounds, after thousands of documented miracles, after surviving decades of Vatican persecution, after being visited by millions of pilgrims from around the world, He saw himself as nothing more than a poor friar who prays. That humility, I think, is the greatest miracle of all. But there's so much more to this story. Let me take you deeper into the mysteries that surrounded this extraordinary man. Let's talk about the confessional, because what happened inside that small wooden booth was perhaps the most transformative aspect of Padre Pio's ministry. People would travel from around the world to confess to Padre Pio. They would wait in line for days, sometimes weeks, just to spend a few minutes with him. Why? Because everyone knew that confessing to Padre Pio was unlike anything else. You couldn't hide from him. You couldn't minimize your sins. You couldn't pretend to be better than you were. He knew. He always knew. There are hundreds of documented accounts of Padre Pio revealing hidden sins to penitents. A man would enter the confessional, begin his confession, and Pio would stop him. "You forgot something," he would say. And then he would name a sin that the man had deliberately concealed, often with specific details that left the penitent shaking. One famous account involves an Italian politician who came to confess in the 1950s. This man had a respectable public image, but he was living a secret life of corruption and moral compromise. He entered the confessional intending to confess only minor sins, keeping his serious transgressions hidden. Padre Pio listened for a moment, then interrupted him. "You come to me with an edited list," he said, "but I see the complete book. Shall I read it to you?" The politician was stunned. Pio then proceeded to describe, in detail, specific corrupt dealings, specific lies, specific betrayals that no one could have known about. He named names. He gave dates. He described private conversations that had taken place behind closed doors. The politician collapsed in tears. He made a complete confession, reformed his life, and became one of Pio's most devoted followers until his death years later. But Pio's gift of reading hearts wasn't just about exposing sin. It was about healing. A woman came to him in deep depression. She had lost her son in an accident years earlier and had never recovered. She blamed herself. She believed that God was punishing her for some unknown sin. She had contemplated suicide many times. Before she could speak a word, Padre Pio looked at her with infinite tenderness and said, "Your son is with God. He is happy. He wants you to stop blaming yourself. The accident was not your fault, and God is not punishing you. He loves you, and so does your son." The woman had told no one about her son. No one at the monastery knew her story, yet Pio knew, and with that knowledge came healing. The woman left the confessional transformed, her years of guilt and grief finally released. Stories like this number in the thousands. They come from every walk of life, peasants and professors, laborers and lawyers, sinners and saints. All of them experience the same thing, being truly seen, truly known, and despite being known, truly loved. Let me tell you about another aspect of Padre Pio's life that the Vatican files document extensively: his relationship with time. Multiple witnesses reported that Padre Pio seemed to exist outside of normal time. His masses, for instance, would last for hours. A typical Catholic Mass takes about an hour. Pio's masses would take 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours. Yet to those present, it felt like only moments had passed. One documented case involves a group of pilgrims who attended Pio's Mass in the 1950s. They entered the church at 6 in the morning. They were certain they had been present for perhaps an hour, maybe an hour and a half. When they left the church, they discovered it was noon. 6 hours had passed, though they would have sworn it was only 1. Conversely, there are accounts of events compressed into impossibly short periods. A woman was praying in the church when she saw Pio enter the confessional. She glanced at her watch. It was 3 o'clock. Pio heard confessions continuously without a break. She watched, never taking her eyes off the confessional except to occasionally check the time. After what seemed like hours, after Pio had heard dozens of confessions, she checked her watch again. It was 3:15. 15 minutes had passed. How do you explain this? The Vatican investigators couldn't. They documented these testimonies, verified them against multiple witnesses, and filed them away as inexplicable. Let's talk about the spiritual warfare that defined Padre Pio's life, because this is an aspect of his story that many people don't know about. From childhood until death, Padre Pio was engaged in constant battle with demonic forces, not metaphorical battles, physical battles, real attacks that left visible wounds and evidence. The other friars at San Giovanni Rotondo would hear terrible sounds coming from Pio's cell at night, crashes, screams, what sounded like physical combat. In the morning, they would find Pio's room in disarray, furniture overturned, and Pio himself covered in bruises and scratches that hadn't been there the night before. Pio described these attacks in his letters. The demons would appear in hideous forms. They would mock him, tempt him, threaten him. They would beat him with chains. They would throw him against walls. They would try to suffocate him. Sometimes the demons would disguise themselves as holy figures to deceive him. They would appear as the Virgin Mary, as Jesus, as angels, hoping to lead him into error. But Pio developed the ability to discern true apparitions from demonic deceptions. One of the most famous incidents occurred in the 1920s. The friars heard an enormous crash from Pio's cell, followed by screaming that didn't sound entirely human. They rushed to his door but found it locked from inside. They could hear sounds of struggle, furniture breaking, Pio praying desperately. When they finally broke down the door, they found Pio unconscious on the floor. His room looked like a battlefield. The furniture was destroyed. His habit was torn. Fresh wounds marked his body. When Pio regained consciousness, he explained that a particularly powerful demon had attacked him, trying to drive him to despair. The battle had lasted hours. In the end, he had prevailed through prayer, but only barely. Why did the demons attack him so viciously? The traditional understanding is that holy souls are particular targets of demonic assault. The greater the soul, the greater the attacks. Pio's sanctity made him a prime target, but there may be another explanation. Padre Pio was liberating souls from demonic bondage. Through his confessions, his prayers, his sacrifices, he was freeing people from the grip of evil. The demons hated him for it. They attacked him in retaliation for every soul he saved. Let's talk about Padre Pio's relationship with the dead, because this is another aspect of his story that reads like something from a supernatural thriller. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Pio conversing with invisible beings. When asked who he was talking to, he would often say he was speaking with the souls in purgatory, the souls of the dead who were being purified before entering heaven. These souls would come to him asking for prayers, for masses to be said on their behalf, for help in their purification. Pio would then pray for them and report when they had finally been released into heaven. One documented case involves a friar who died at another monastery hundreds of miles away. Padre Pio was celebrating Mass when he suddenly stopped and began praying intensely for a specific intention. After Mass, he told the other friars that their brother had just died and was in need of prayers. The friars were skeptical. They had received no news of any death. But hours later, a telegram arrived confirming that the friar had indeed died at the exact moment when Pio had stopped his Mass to pray for him. On another occasion, a man came to Pio asking for prayers for his deceased father. Pio looked at him strangely and said, "Your father is not dead. He's very much alive and will be for many more years." The man was confused. His father had died months ago. He had attended the funeral himself. Pio smiled and explained. The man he thought was his father was not his biological father. His real father was alive and well. The man who had raised him was actually his stepfather, a secret that had been kept from him his entire life. The man investigated and discovered that Pio was right. He had been adopted as an infant. His biological father was indeed still alive. How could Pio have known this? How could he have known something that the man himself didn't know? The files are full of such stories, stories of knowledge that defies explanation, stories of connections between the living and the dead, stories of a man who seemed to exist with one foot in our world and one foot in another. Let me share some of the most dramatic bilocation accounts, because these are among the most well-documented phenomena associated with Padre Pio. Bilocation is the alleged ability to be present in two places at once. It sounds impossible. It sounds like fantasy, yet dozens of credible witnesses, including doctors, priests, and military officials, reported experiencing it firsthand. The most famous case, which I mentioned earlier, involves the World War II bombing squadron. But there are many others. In 1921, while Pio was under strict Vatican restrictions and confined to his monastery, a priest in Rome was celebrating Mass when he looked up and saw Padre Pio standing in the sanctuary. Pio was clearly visible, wearing his Capuchin habit, with visible bloodstains on his hands. The priest was so startled that he nearly dropped the chalice. When he looked again, Pio was gone. The priest immediately wrote to San Giovanni Rotondo to confirm that Pio was there. The response confirmed that Pio had not left the monastery. He had been in the chapel at the exact time the priest had seen him in Rome, over 200 miles away. Another well-documented case occurred in 1940. An Italian general was leading troops in North Africa when his convoy was ambushed. The general was certain they would all be killed. Suddenly, a monk appeared among them, a Capuchin with blood-stained hands. The monk told them to follow him. He led them through a path that avoided all the enemy positions. When they reached safety, the monk disappeared. Years later, the general saw a photograph of Padre Pio. He immediately recognized him as the monk who had saved his life in the desert. He traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo to thank him. When he arrived, before he could say anything, Pio greeted him by name and said, "So you got out safely. I was worried about you." The general had never met Pio before, had never written to him, had never told anyone at the monastery about his experience. Yet Pio knew him. Pio remembered being there in the desert, hundreds of miles from Italy. There are accounts of Pio appearing to people in America, in South America, in the Philippines, always, at moments of crisis, always offering exactly the help that was needed. These appearances were often verified by multiple witnesses and confirmed by Pio himself, though he rarely spoke about them publicly. How is this possible? The Vatican investigated extensively and could find no natural explanation. They concluded that either these witnesses were lying or mistaken, or something genuinely supernatural was occurring. But here's the thing. These weren't ignorant peasants prone to religious hysteria. Among the witnesses were doctors, lawyers, military officers, priests, bishops, people whose testimony would be accepted in any court of law, people who had no reason to lie and everything to lose by making such claims. The evidence for bilocation in Padre Pio's case is stronger than for almost any other historical figure. And the Vatican had all of it in their files, locked away for decades. Let me tell you about Padre Pio's physical suffering, because this is often overlooked in discussions of his miraculous gifts. The stigmata were not a blessing. They were an agony. For 50 years, Pio lived with open wounds in his hands, feet, and side. These wounds bled constantly, losing about a cup of blood daily. The pain was excruciating. Imagine trying to celebrate Mass with wounds in your hands. Imagine trying to walk with wounds in your feet. Imagine trying to sleep, to eat, to perform any daily activity while in constant, unrelenting pain. Medical examinations confirmed that the wounds were extraordinarily painful. The tissue around them was highly sensitive. Even gentle touching caused Pio to wince. Yet he celebrated Mass every day. He heard confessions for hours on end. He received pilgrims, blessed them, listened to their problems. He never complained. In 50 years of suffering, he never asked why. He never questioned God's plan. He simply accepted the pain as his vocation, his way of sharing in Christ's redemptive suffering. In addition to the stigmata, Pio suffered from numerous other ailments throughout his life. Chronic bronchitis, severe stomach problems, recurring fevers, joint pain that made movement difficult. Any one of these conditions would have been enough to keep an ordinary person bedridden. Pio endured them all while maintaining a demanding schedule of prayer and ministry. He slept only 2 or 3 hours a night. The rest of his nights were spent in prayer, in spiritual battle, or simply in pain that made sleep impossible. He ate very little, sometimes surviving on barely more than the Eucharistic bread he consumed at Mass. By any medical standard, he should have died young. His body was subjected to extraordinary stresses, yet he lived to 81 years old, remaining active until the final days of his life. Doctors who examined him could never quite explain how he functioned. His blood loss alone should have caused severe anemia and weakness. Instead, he displayed remarkable stamina and energy. It was as if something beyond normal biology was sustaining him. Let me talk about the legacy that Padre Pio left behind, because it extends far beyond his personal story. During his lifetime, Pio conceived a vision for a hospital that would serve the poor of southern Italy. He called it the Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, the house for the relief of suffering. Despite having no money, no resources, and no medical expertise, he set about making this vision a reality. The hospital opened in 1956 and has grown into one of the largest and most advanced medical facilities in southern Europe. It treats hundreds of thousands of patients each year. It conducts cutting-edge medical research. It serves as a symbol of Padre Pio's practical compassion, his desire not just to pray for the suffering, but to actively relieve it. The hospital was built largely through donations from pilgrims and devoted followers. Pio himself never handled money, but his presence attracted resources that made the impossible possible. Today, the hospital continues to operate, serving patients regardless of their ability to pay. Padre Pio also founded prayer groups that spread around the world. These groups, which continue to meet today, focus on prayer, charity, and spiritual growth. There are thousands of them across the globe with millions of members. They represent one of the largest lay movements in the Catholic Church. The shrine at San Giovanni Rotondo has become the second most visited Catholic pilgrimage site in the world, after only the Vatican itself. 8 million pilgrims visit each year. They come from every continent, every nation, every walk of life. They come to pray at Pio's tomb, to attend Mass in the church he served, to walk the grounds he walked. The town itself has been transformed. What was once a remote, impoverished village is now a thriving community built around the pilgrimage industry. Hotels, restaurants, and shops have sprung up to serve the millions of visitors. The local economy is entirely dependent on the continuing devotion to Padre Pio. But perhaps the most significant legacy is the impact on individual lives. Millions of people credit Padre Pio with transforming their faith, healing their bodies, saving their souls. They continue to report miracles, answered prayers, and supernatural encounters to this day, decades after his death. The Vatican continues to receive reports of miracles attributed to Padre Pio. Many of these are investigated according to the strict protocols of the canonization process. The files on Padre Pio continue to grow, even now. Let me address the skeptics, because I know many of you watching have questions and doubts. The skeptical position on Padre Pio essentially comes down to a few arguments. First, that the stigmata could have been self-inflicted. Second, that the supposed miracles have natural explanations. Third, that the witnesses were credulous believers prone to exaggeration. Fourth, that the entire phenomenon was a kind of mass hysteria or psychological contagion. Let's examine each of these. The self-infliction theory was the Vatican's primary hypothesis for decades. They assumed Pio was either deliberately creating his wounds or unconsciously causing them through some psychological mechanism. But decades of investigation couldn't substantiate this. The wounds were examined by numerous doctors, including hostile skeptics specifically chosen for their disbelief. They found no evidence of self-infliction. The wounds didn't display the characteristics typical of self-mutilation. There were no signs of the tools or substances that would be needed to maintain such wounds over 50 years. The wounds healed instantly and completely at death, something that wouldn't happen with self-inflicted wounds. The natural explanation theory has similar problems. The medical documentation of healings attributed to Pio is extensive. Doctors examined patients before and after their claimed healings. They documented conditions that should have been permanent or fatal. They then documented complete recoveries that defied medical explanation. Not all claimed miracles survived scrutiny, but many did, which is why the Vatican accepted them for canonization. The credulous witness theory fails when you look at who the witnesses actually were. Many were educated professionals with no particular religious devotion. Military officers, government officials, doctors who came specifically to debunk the phenomena, skeptical journalists looking for a story. Many of these witnesses became believers precisely because they couldn't explain what they saw. The mass hysteria theory doesn't account for the physical evidence. Mass hysteria can cause people to see things that aren't there. It can't cause wounds that bleed for 50 years. It can't cause documented medical conditions to vanish. It can't cause a dead man's wounds to heal instantaneously. None of this proves that the supernatural explanation is correct. But it does show that the natural explanations have significant problems. The evidence doesn't easily fit into any materialistic framework. Perhaps the most honest position is the one held by several Vatican investigators over the years. They couldn't explain what they found, could not prove it was miraculous, could not explain it at all. The phenomena associated with Padre Pio remain, in the most literal sense, mysteries. Let me conclude with some thoughts on what Padre Pio's story means for us today. We live in an age of profound skepticism. We assume that the material world is all there is, that science has explained or will explain everything, that miracles belong to a primitive past that we have outgrown. Padre Pio challenges these assumptions. Here was a man who lived in the 20th century, in the modern world, who was investigated by scientists and doctors using modern methods, and who still defied explanation. Here was evidence for the supernatural that didn't come from ancient texts or distant legends, but from living witnesses, medical records, and official investigations. You don't have to become a believer to take this evidence seriously. You don't have to convert to Catholicism to find Padre Pio's story fascinating and troubling. You just have to be willing to entertain the possibility that our confident materialism might be missing something. What if there's more to reality than what we can measure? What if the supernatural isn't just superstition, but an actual dimension of existence that occasionally breaks through into our world? What if the millions of people who have claimed religious experiences throughout history weren't all deluded or lying? Padre Pio's story doesn't answer these questions, but it poses them in a way that's hard to dismiss. The evidence is there. The files have been opened. What you do with that information is up to you. If this video moved you, if you learned something you didn't know, if you found yourself questioning what you thought was possible, please share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me what you think. Was Padre Pio a genuine mystic, a clever fraud, something in between? I want to know your thoughts. The files have been opened, the secrets have been revealed. Now it's up to you to decide what to believe. Until next time.